Hi. Hi, everyone. First, I just want to thank Peter for that really thoughtful and kind and insightful, I guess, introduction. I also want to thank him for being such a great collaborator. And I should say up front that a lot of my ideas for this project have been shaped by a project that we have been working on together in both Vienna and Chicago. I also want to thank Giannis for inviting me and Philippe, and for the courage to try and pull this off. This is my first talk in a tent, and I hope it's not my last. It's, pretty cool. I will apologize that I don't have images to show you. I was a little nervous about how that was going to work, but I hope that the stories I'm going to tell will nonetheless capture your attention, and if not, you'll have the sound of children playing and birds singing, so that will compensate, I think. For decades before the First World War, the world seemed to shrink. Millions of migrants crossed the globe. The railway and steamship accelerated their journeys, reducing the cost and risk of travel. The world also arrived on the doorsteps of those who stayed home via the telegraph, the radio, newspapers, cinema, exhibitions, and foreign goods. To many observers, the growing interconnection of people and states seemed unstoppable, and they equated all of this mobility with freedom, the topic of our gathering over these days. The free movement of people, goods, and capital across borders, they believed, would engender greater political, economic, and cultural freedom. Freedom of mobility would bring progress, prosperity, and peace. You probably know where I'm going. Those illusions were shattered in 1914, when the First World War ushered in 2 decades of anti-global retrenchment. Even committed internationalists, quote, have lost faith and join in the chorus of those who never sympathized with our ideals and say internationalism has failed, despaired Mary Sheepshanks, a British feminist and internationalist. Although she was confident that the spirit of internationalism would return once, quote, the fumes cleared from men's brains, it had been replaced for the moment by race hatred and national jealousy, leading to tariffs, militarism, crushing taxation, restricted intercourse, mutual butchery, and the ruin of all progress, end quote. The year was 1916. Hundreds of thousands of European boys and men were already dead, and nearly everyone was penning obituaries for internationalism. As we know, the fumes did not clear quickly. More than 25 years later, the Austrian Jewish writer Stefan Zweig would publish his famous memoir, The World of Yesterday. It was in some ways not only a nostalgic eulogy for the Habsburg Empire, but also for a lost era of globalism. Zweig, a self-described citizen of the world, recalled, quote, before 1914, the earth had belonged to all. There were no permits, no visas, and it always gives me pleasure to astonish the young by telling them that before 1914, I traveled from Europe to India and to America without passport and without ever having seen one. After the war, everything changed for the worse, in his opinion. The world was on the defensive against strangers. The humiliations, which once had been devised with criminals alone in mind, were now imposed upon the traveler before and during every journey. There had to be photographs from right and left in profile and full face. One's hair had to be cropped sufficiently to make the ears visible. Fingerprints were taken. They asked for the addresses of relatives for moral and financial guarantees, questionnaires. And if only one of this sheaf of papers was missing, one was lost. He linked these bureaucratic humiliations to the lost dream of a united world. If I reckon up the many forms I have filled out during these years, the many examinations and interrogations at frontiers that I have been through, then I feel keenly how much human dignity has been lost in this century, which in our youth we credulously dreamed as one of freedom, as of the federation of the world. In Britain, economist John Maynard Keynes penned his own obituary for globalization shortly after the First World War ended. And he focused not on the mobility of people, but on the mobility of goods. Quote, what an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age which was to come to an end in August 1914. In the golden age of the war, he wrote, The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. It was an age in which, quote, the projects of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, of monopolies, restrictions, and exclusion, which were to play serpent to this paradise, were little more than the amusements of his daily newspaper. These looming threats appeared to exercise almost no influence at all on the ordinary course of his social and economic life, the internationalization of which was nearly complete in practice, end quote. Stefan Zweig and John Maynard Keynes remain among the most famous analysts of the changes brought by the First World War, and they both understood those changes in terms of an end of a golden era of freedom, during which people, goods, and capital breezed across international frontiers. But I would argue that their very nostalgia for a lost world of globalism offers an important clue as to the causes of its downfall. Both of these men were myopic about the extent to which the freedoms that they associated with globalization were actually privileges of a very narrow elite. The earth had not belonged to everyone before 1914. It had, however, belonged to men like Keynes and Zweig. Zweig and Keynes traveled the world unmolested by bureaucrats before World War I, largely because they were wealthy, highly educated, white European men. They traveled freely for business and pleasure with no concern for their physical safety, nor did they worry about the meddlesome interference of husbands, fathers, or state authorities. In steerage class, the world of yesterday looked very different. Migrants headed toward the United States around 1900 were already subjected to the poking and prodding of doctors who were charged with excluding sick, disabled, and undesirable migrants. Non-whites were categorically excluded. Millions of people lived in deep poverty in regions that were denied political sovereignty and exploited economically for the benefit of Europeans and North Americans. And while international trade may have benefited all parties in the aggregate, it exacerbated inequality between rich and poor countries. Likewise, within industrialized lands, globalization did not benefit everyone equally. There were clear winners and losers. Keynes frankly acknowledged this. The bounty of globalization was not shared equally, but inequality, he claimed, was seen as a necessary corollary to progress in the 19th century. He wrote, "The greater part of the population, it is true, worked hard and lived at a low standard of comfort, yet were to all appearances reasonably contented with this lot. This was because they believed in the prospect of social mobility. Escape was possible," he insisted, "for any man of capacity or character at all exceeding the average." The First World War radically disrupted this equilibrium. The magnitude of wartime sacrifices bred popular demands for more immediate justice. Across Europe and the world, workers, women, and colonial subjects took to the streets, demanding sovereignty and greater equality. In Russia, the discontent combusted into revolution, which seemed poised to spread westward. The wheels of global integration ground to a halt. This era of anti-globalism lasted another 2 decades, punctuated by the greatest global economic crisis in world history, the Great Depression. Nor would the strife be overcome with a treaty or a peaceful handshake. Rather, as American journalist Dorothy Thompson would write from Berlin in 1931, quote, "Looking at Europe from the British Isles to the Balkans, one is forced to admit that after 12 years of the League of Nations, the International Court, multilateral treaties, Kellogg Pacts, the International Bank, and disarmament conferences, the whole world is retreating from the international position and is taking their dolls and going home." So why and how did so many people turn against the world after 1918, and what were the consequences of this anti-global turn? My current work attempts to answer these questions. I explore the ways in which popular political and social movements, both on the right and the left, sought to pause, reverse, or regulate globalization after the First World War. And in particular, today I want to focus on how these debates about globalization were linked to contested ideas of freedom in the aftermath of the war. The freedom of movement of people, goods, and capital was increasingly pit against a different sort of imagined freedom. Freedom from dependence on imported foods and energy. Freedom from the instability of the global economy and business cycles. Freedom from colonial domination or growing inequality. There is no question about the decline of global mobility and trade in this period. In 1914, trade accounted for 30% of the world economy, an all-time high. By 1933, it had slumped to a low of 10% and did not fully recover until the 1970s. Transatlantic migration, which reached its peak of 2.1 million in 1913, came to a sputtering halt during the war. Global communication also broke down. News that had traveled via telegraph from Europe to North America and Australia in a single day in 1913 took weeks to arrive in 1920. The gold standard, which was the motor of global financial integration, broke down during the First World War and was abandoned roadside during the 1930s, first by Great Britain in 1931, then by the United States in 1933, and finally by France and other European powers. While trade, migration, and international cooperation did all recover briefly during the late 1920s, the Great Depression dealt a decisive blow. The economic and political history of globalization and deglobalization are critically important, and many other scholars, including some in this room, are doing that work. But my own focus has been on the grassroots political and social movements that mobilized against globalism and internationalism between the wars. I use the term anti-globalism to refer to movements that sought to insulate societies from the global economy by mobilizing against policies, people, and institutions that they associated, rightly or wrongly, with globalization or internationalism. Sometimes these movements produced actual deglobalization, the slowdown or curtailment of transnational flows of people, ideas, goods, or capital. The people and movements I write about, however, did not use the term deglobalization at the time. They spoke of freedom versus dependence on the global economy, nationalism versus internationalism, sovereignty and its violation. They promoted autarky, self-sufficiency, and economic insulation. So I use the terms globalization and deglobalization critically and with some important caveats. These terms, it should be said, came into widespread use in the 1990s at a time when a certain kind of free market capitalism and global integration appeared to be the unstoppable victors of history, and were also closely identified with both democracy and political freedom. After communism's collapse in Eastern Europe in 1989, many social scientists and journalists began to talk about globalization like they once spoke about modernization. It seemed to be an irrepressible force that moved only in one direction. McDonald's opened in Moscow, global finance was ascendant, and a new innovation called the World Wide Web was bringing people into ever more constant communication. But one only needed to look backward to see forward. The history of Europe between 1918 and 1939 reveals very clearly that the history of globalization was punctuated by pauses and attempted reversals. Yet many analysts in the 90s and beyond maintain that globalization was a natural economic process, which would accelerate indefinitely if only left unmolested by government intervention. They saw deglobalization, by contrast, including the deglobalization of the interwar period, as the product of unnatural political interferences with that process. A closer look at the history of global integration in the 19th century reveals very clearly that there was nothing natural or apolitical about it, nor was it directed by an invisible hand. Imperial states and armies guaranteed that their colonies would be hospitable to foreign investments and that debtors would pay back international loans. Popular support for free trade in Britain was embedded in a popular political culture that had to be sustained through active political campaigning. Even at the moment of globalization's most rapid acceleration, free trade was more a British exception than the rule. After a brief period of openness in the 1860s and 70s, tariff walls sprung up again across the European continent. Bismarck's infamous coalition of wealthy industrialists and landowners demanded protection from iron and rye, and France, Austria-Hungary, and other European states quickly followed. The United States maintained high tariffs right up to the eve of the First World War. Another problem is that globalization and deglobalization might appear to be binary opposites. Yet, as we will see, deglobalization and globalization, much like nationalism and internationalism, were often flip sides of the same coin. This simultaneity was nothing new in 1914 or 1918. It was baked into the foundation of internationalist projects and accelerating global connection in the 19th century. As historian Jürgen Osterhammel has argued, once the era of globalization began, quote, conflict and cooperation, integration and disengagement were taking place on a global scale. There was simply no escaping one another. So globalization and anti-globalism rose in tandem. Even between the two world wars, global flows often moved into new channels and morphed into new shapes rather than simply rising or falling. Even the most radical anti-globalists rarely sought, let alone achieved, total isolation from the global economy or autarky. They rather sought globalization on their own terms, or at least better terms. And anti-globalists themselves organized in transnational networks, a phenomenon that was frequently noted at the time by contemporaries. Quote, the only international which seems to be winning these days is the international of the anti-internationalists, quipped Dorothy Thompson in 1931. Anti-globalism and deglobalization are also not simply another name for nationalism. Nationalism and anti-globalism were, and to this day remain, closely connected, but there were many contexts in which nationalism and anti-globalism departed company. For example, anti-colonialists in interwar India insisted on the need for greater economic self-sufficiency, but they also promoted a self-consciously globalist political agenda. They argued that more economic independence would produce a more genuine form of freedom and internationalism based on cooperation rather than colonial exploitation. Many European socialists in the 1920s and 1930s also called for political internationalism, but simultaneously sought to insulate domestic workers from foreign competition. Indeed, one of the most striking things about anti-globalism in both the past and the present is its political promiscuity. Anti-global movements gained ground across Europe and in the United States and beyond in the 1930s. On the right and the left, in fascist states and in the most resilient democracies, and in the parliaments of small states, as well as great powers. So what did anti-globalism look like on the ground? And where and when and why did it actually begin? And how did it relate to debates about freedom? While Stefan Zweig remembered the era before the First World War as one of unfettered mobility, anxieties about globalization began well before 1914, inspiring both state-led and social reform projects that aimed to control and direct global mobility. Gino Speranza was one such reformer. Speranza, whose name means hope, had been born to middle-class Italian parents in Connecticut in 1872. He eventually attended NYU Law School and became an attorney and an advisor to the Italian Consulate General in New York. Specializing in immigration issues, Speranza worked on behalf of the Italian government to protect the rights of Italian immigrants in the United States. So his position mediating between migrants and governments gave him a unique vantage point. Like many other self-identified internationalists in his time, he celebrated globalization as an unstoppable process that was inherently progressive. He described globalization as a, quote, new spirit that was changing the world for the better. Speranza identified both mass migration and globalization with freedom and progress. He wrote, this new spirit is one of greater individual freedom, freedom to move and see, freedom of the laborer to try his hand and his craft and to seek opportunity anywhere, powerfully aided by immense improvements in international relations and by wonderful facilities for travel and communication. But Speranza also feared that these new individual freedoms created new dangers in the United States. He wrote, wonderful as this new force is, it does not follow, however, that we should let it carry to our shores on its broad wave all sorts of persons of all classes and conditions in every state of development or in any stage of decay. Every great tide carries some refuse and debris. So what sort of debris concerned him most? At congressional hearings on immigration before the First World War, he advocated both social and eugenic criteria. We do not want anybody who may either bring down our physique through physical or moral causes, or anybody who is going to increase the criminality in this country. I think when you sift it all down, it comes largely to that. Speranza was far from isolated in these views. Before the First World War began, there was already a growing number of voices expressing discontents with globalization from all sides of the political spectrum. Anti-globalism was really a product of two developments that coincided in the late 19th century. First was the acceleration of globalization itself, which created its own reaction. But second, the rise of mass politics and expansion of political suffrage meant that people who were negatively affected by global integration, or who felt as though they were negatively affected, had the ability to talk back at the ballot box or in the streets. By the turn of the 20th century, it was already clear that gains from free trade, imperial expansion, and mass migration were not shared equally. Inequality was generating radical social and political movements on the right and left. In Germany, economists already began to sound alarm bells about a globalizing food market, arguing that reliance on imports would compromise both the economy and national security. Xenophobia intensified and migration restrictions also multiplied both in the United States and in Europe. The US began to impose limits in the 1880s with an all-out ban on Chinese migrants in 1882, followed by prohibitions on individuals seen as morally, mentally, or physically deficient. Germany reinforced its borders and ports against the influx of allegedly diseased East European Jews, and countries of mass emigration also mobilized to stop what they saw as a massive hemorrhaging of human capital. So with all that said, the First World War was still an important turning point, ushering in a new era of skepticism about the risks and the rewards of global interdependence. On the one hand, of course, the First World War was a global war. It mobilized human and material resources around the world, set soldiers adrift to far-flung locations, and increased especially international financial entanglement through a massive web of debt, especially debts to the United States. The war even precipitated a global flu pandemic as disease traveled the world with soldiers and refugees. At the same time, the war produced unprecedented supply chain issues, to use a familiar phrase. The cost of shipping tripled and inflation soared. States introduced tariffs and exchange controls and sought to cut off supplies from their enemies. The most successful and infamous of these efforts was the Allied naval blockade. The number of Germans and Austrians who starved to death is still being debated, but it is undebatable that many Central Europeans blamed the blockade at the time for their defeat and vowed that they would never again be dependent for their security or survival on imported food. Freedom to them meant freedom from dependence on foreign food. And the term in German was Nährungsfreiheit. So the freedom was even baked into the word, into the concept. Many measures introduced during wartime for one purpose continued or became models for anti-global policies and politics after the war. In the name of security, states required travelers to carry passports when they traveled abroad, a new innovation. It was supposed to be temporary, but the requirement was not lifted after the war. In Allied countries, boycotting German goods was seen as a matter of patriotism during the war, but continued afterwards in the name of economic protection. Demobilized soldiers took their weapons home. Some were inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution and joined radical internationalist, pacifist, socialist, and communist movements and parties. But the reaction to left-wing forms of globalism, both real and imagined, was immediate and violent. In the US, there was isolationism, the Red Scare, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which transformed from an organization not only to terrorize Blacks in the South, but also immigrants and Jews in the Midwest and Northeast. Prohibition, the ban on all purchase and sale of alcohol, reflected animosity toward Catholic immigrants who were believed to abuse alcohol. Popular xenophobia and anti-migration movements flourished, resulting in even more laws to restrict mobility. And the most famous and consequential of those was the Quota Act, which choked off immigration for decades based on racist quotas. In Budapest and Munich, counter-revolutionary paramilitary groups hunted Jews in the street as anti-Semites linked Jews to both global capitalism and international Bolshevism at the same time. States that had once traded freely quickly erected protective barriers against one another. So Europe now had 38 economic units instead of 26, 27 different currencies instead of 13, and customs frontiers that extended an additional 6,000 to 7,000 kilometers. After a brief period of recovery and growth in the 1920s, the Great Depression unsettled the convictions of many former advocates of free trade. John Maynard Keynes famously wrote in 1932, quote, "I sympathize with those who would minimize rather than those who would maximize economic entanglement between nations. Ideas, knowledge, art, Hospitality, travel, these are the things which should of their nature be international, but let goods be homespun whenever it is reasonably and conveniently possible. And above all, let finance be primarily national. And Keynes compared making this statement to having broken from a religion. It was such a radical kind of change of heart for an economist at the time. Anti-global movements were tightly linked to the collapse of continental empires and new challenges to overseas empires. One of the most obvious parallels to interwar campaigns for autarky in Europe was the Swadeshi movement in India. The goal there was a complete boycott of British goods and the increased production of homespun cloth called khadi and clothing in particular. Our freedom will be won through the spinning wheel, Gandhi declared in 1921. He argued that spinning would protect female virtue, prevent famine, and promote Indian independence. Quote, the revival of hand spinning is the least penance we must do for the sin of our forefathers in having succumbed to the satanic influences of the foreign manufacturer. The problem was that even as anti-colonial nationalists demanded an end to empire, many states began to see the expansion and consolidation of empires as their own route to freedom from the global economy. Britain and France both attempted to rely more on raw materials from their empires during the Great Depression. Empire shopping became a mass movement in Britain in the 1920s, encouraging women to purchase, cook, and eat only foods grown in the empire, which really meant supporting white farmers in places like Canada, Australia, and Kenya. In 1932, the Ottawa Agreement officially established the principle of imperial free trade in Britain, creating a system of preferential tariffs for trade within the empire. Japan, meanwhile, strove to create an anti-colonial autarkic empire in East Asia. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was intended to be a self-sufficient regional bloc free of white Western domination, led, of course, by Japan. Nazi geopolitical experts such as Karl Haushofer, meanwhile, saw the Japanese Empire, along with the United States and Russia, as a model for what Germany would achieve in Central Europe. Hitler and Mussolini are remembered for their efforts to conquer the world rather than as anti-globalists, but the drive for empire in interwar Italy, Germany, Japan, and elsewhere was often justified in the name of achieving economic self-sufficiency. So in a way, these were anti-global empires. The revolt against globalization was particularly fierce in states that had either lost empires at the end of World War I, like Germany and Austria, or imagined or felt that they had been treated badly, like Italy. The Paris peace treaties transformed large sectors of the German and Austrian population into bitter critics of both globalization and liberal internationalism. That bitterness was exacerbated by hunger. As I mentioned, during the First World War, Britain had imposed a successful naval blockade on Germany and Austria and Hungary, and continued the blockade after the war in order to force the losers to accept the terms of the peace treaties. The lesson learned was that only greater self-sufficiency could prevent mass hunger. So in the time that remains, I'd like to zoom in a bit and tell you a bit more about the drive to become more self-sufficient in food production in interwar Austria, which I think illustrates many of the broader dynamics of these movements. It started with a movement to deglobalize the dinner table. So-called wild settlements appeared around Vienna before the First World War even ended, as unemployed workers and returning soldiers illegally occupied land, built dwellings out of wood planks, waste material, and dirt, and ate what they could grow. There were at least 70,000 Viennese allotment gardeners at the end of the war, and they organized themselves into a mass movement, demanding support from the government. In one protest, 100,000 settlers and gardeners marched on the Ringstrasse. The settlement movement was explicitly about turning inward rather than outward, colonizing the homeland instead of the rest of the world. And one of these movements even called themselves colonies in the homeland. Intercolonization is pure colonial politics, explained a writer in the Kronenzeitung. The only difference is that it does not involve the colonization of some foreign land, but rather the colonization of our own homeland. Initially, the settlement movement had strong ties to social democracy and pre-war Lebensreform movements. In 1920, Otto Neurath, the Vienna Circle philosopher and social democrat, co-founded the Austrian Association for Settlement and Small Gardens with Hans Kampfmeyer, a founder of the German Garden City movement. That association employed Adolf Loos and Margareta Schulte-Lehotzky, the first female architect in Austria, to design homes for settlers. Loos saw the settler movement as nothing less than revolutionary. He wrote in 1921, quote, "This new movement, which has infested all of the residents of the city like a fever, the settlement movement demands new humans." Autarkic ideas were fundamental to this vision. "One often used to speak of Austrian cuisine," he wrote. "Only today we have realized that this cuisine was only possible because there was a state form called the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. We have now lost everything that nourished us, and that means re-education. We need to create our own national cuisine. The Bohemian dumpling, the Moravian buchtel, the Italian schnitzel, all things that were an unshakable part of Viennese cuisine for centuries must now be replaced by local foods." I guess we all know how that turned out. Loos, Neurath, and Schulte-Lehotzky promoted a utopian vision of settlers' lives in modern, healthy, well-planned homes and communities. And Schulte-Lehotzky is most famous for having designed the Frankfurt kitchen, this very efficient modern kitchen. But the prototype for that was actually built in the first settlers' home outside of Vienna. In reality, however, the settlement movement and the broader movement for autarky required a great deal of sacrifice, of convenience, luxury, and variety for the sake of independence. Most settlers' homes had no gas, electricity, or indoor toilets in the 1930s. Max Ammers, a leader of the settlement movement, argued that autarky should be supported by draconian taxes on luxury goods, including alcohol and tobacco, but also cars, hotels, cafes, coffee, tea, and postcards. Another settlement advocate suggested that settlers should trade meat and potatoes for a local diet consisting solely of chestnuts, goat's milk, and apples. In spite of the involvement of these experts and political parties, the settlement movement was really driven from below. Requests for settlement projects flooded government offices. Some settlers simply occupied uncultivated land and refused to leave until the government gave in to their demands. A group of prospective settlers in 1927 invoked the consequences of the dismemberment of the Habsburg Empire. "The loss of our once large economic territory has had catastrophic effects, and it is the duty of all far-sighted statesmen to devote every possible effort to save our people from their downfall. That requires denser settlement of the land, intercolonization." Petitioners compared their plans for intercolonization favorably to schemes for overseas settlement. While overseas emigration entailed, quote, "the departure of the most valuable part of the population, an irreplaceable loss for the economy, and a lasting weakening of our national power," intercolonization, they argued, would preserve all of these human resources for the homeland. So the movement was actually very politically broad in the 1920s. Proponents of settlement on both the left and right shared the goals of achieving self-sufficiency at both the level of the nation and the individual, along with combating unemployment and addressing the urban housing shortage. They shared biopolitical goals as well. Rural settlement was supposed to improve the health, welfare, and family life of working-class Austrians. But that does not mean that right and left-wing anti-globalism were the same. On the right, anti-globalists typically imagined the nation as the primary victim of globalization and internationalism. The enemies, their enemies typically included Jews, Bolshevik internationalists, liberal internationalists, feminist internationalists, migrants and refugees, foreigners, and foreign capitalists. Anti-globalists on the left were not necessarily anti-nationalist at all, but they generally depicted the worker rather than the nation as the primary victim of globalization, understanding it in terms of capitalist exploitation. Many left-wing anti-globalists also saw rural homesteads and home production as a potential shelters from the vacillations of the business cycle. But they simultaneously demanded land reform and new forms of social protection to address the instability and inequality created by the fluctuations of the global economy. By the mid-1920s, however, there was growing ambivalence about settlement on the left. Vienna's socialist city government began to focus famously on creating mass urban housing for workers in 1927, rather than suburban settlements and single-family homes. Some social democrats worried that workers who spent all of their free time raising chickens would have no time to attend political meetings. It was only the Great Depression that really quieted those skeptics as desperation set in to feed and occupy unemployed workers in any way possible. So socialists supported Vienna's first so-called Stadtransiedlung in 1932, choosing settlers partly based on their membership and loyalty to the Socialist Party. Now, rural settlement, self-sufficiency, and intercolonization appeared to offer a last hope for independence from the free-falling global economy. These projects had very mixed results. Austrian farmers produced 3 times as many potatoes in 1931 as they had in 1919, 20 times as much sugar and 10 times as much milk. But the reality of settler life was often disappointing. Many settlers were still collecting unemployment payments in the late 1930s. Settlers in Leopoldau on the outskirts of Vienna had no schools, doctors, public transit, gas, electricity, sewage, or stores in the 1930s, and the settlements were often flooded. Settlers interviewed decades later recalled hunger and bone-chilling cold due to a lack of heating in the winter. There was never enough food left to sell, and alcohol abuse was allegedly epidemic. Female settlers often had a particularly rough life, working 13 to 14-hour days. In fact, the entire settlement movement was premised on the unpaid labor of women and children, and for some advocates of settlement, that was precisely the point, to get women out of the workforce. When the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, the Austrian settlement movement was easily incorporated into the Nazi campaign for nutritional freedom. Hitler announced his 4-year plan to achieve autarky in 1936, but anti-internationalism was always a part of the Nazi platform. In a July 1932 election campaign, Hitler proclaimed, "There's so much international, so much world conscience. There's the League of Nations, the Disarmament Conference, Moscow, the Second International, the Third International, and what did all that produce for Germany?" The Nazi ideal of blood and soil was constructed in opposition to Jewish cosmopolitanism, migration, liberal internationalism, and the global economy. At the first Reichsfarmer Day in 1934, Undersecretary of Agriculture Herbert Backe lamented that in previous decades, quote, "the relationship between the folk and its territory was blown up by the transnational global economy. Individuals no longer felt bound to the folk to which they belonged by blood, did not feel rooted in their native soil, but instead belonged above all to a global economic community." When the Nazis came to power in Germany and eventually in Austria, they did so on a surge of anti-global rhetoric and activism. But there was still disagreement behind the scenes among leading Nazis about the ideal relationship of the Third Reich to the global economy. So in 1936, Robert Ley, who was the leader of the German Workers' Front and not coincidentally represented consumers, mocked Germans who would ostracize a German housewife, quote, "who buys Brazilian coffee or a few Spanish lemons" as a traitor to the folk. For Ley, autarky meant backwardness. Cutting ourselves off from the global economy over the long run means not only renouncing conveniences of daily life that are provided by foreign goods, it means renouncing participation in the cultural and technological advancement of the world, he wrote. The regime continued to convey contradictory messages to the German public in the 1930s. On the one hand, German consumers, particularly women, were flooded with propaganda urging them to cook and eat only local foods, boycott chain stores, and even take up the spinning wheel to knit their own textiles. Nazi leaders continued to promote settlement as a means to achieve autarky. But behind the scenes, an expert in the Reichsbank confessed, quote, "even if we had 20 million sheep, we would only be able to produce 20% of the wool we consume domestically." So the solution, of course, was imperial expansion, disguised by the term Großraumwirtschaft. Already in the 1920s and 30s, German academics, institutions, and businesses turned toward the Balkans to replace other economic relationships, building an informal empire that provided Germany with both raw materials and political influence. After 1939, Nazi policymakers shifted from seeking autarky for the German nation toward achieving autarky for continental Europe, which of course was to be dominated by Germany, inspired by the United States, Japan, and Russia. When fascists went to war in pursuit of more land, they were prepared. Female settlement experts in Nazi Germany became settlement advisors in the occupied East. And years of autarkic propaganda also prepared citizens for wartime shortages and a do-it-yourself homespun economy. The interwar drive for self-sufficiency cannot, however, simply be characterized as a far-right fantasy. It justified racist forms of imperial conquest and restrictions on migration. It helped produce the cult of the single-family home and garden and a return to more traditional gender roles. But it also energized anti-colonial nationalists who saw self-sufficiency as a route to freedom from colonial rule. And it inspired initiatives big and small that improve people's lives, from urban gardens to ambitious social policies that aim to reduce the precarity caused by the instability of the global economy. Alongside movements for local foods and home production, it galvanized efforts to increase agricultural production, including technologies that ultimately made land more productive and reduced global hunger. And it transformed internationalism itself, which flourished during and after the Second World War as experts in international organizations such as the League of Nations and then the United Nations regrouped and sought to reconstruct the global economy. Indeed, the challenges posed by anti-globalists to the association between freedom and unfettered globalization between the two world wars set the stage for the emergence of the post-war welfare state and policies of economic development that aim to reduce inequality domestically and internationally, to make globalization more compatible with what Roosevelt would call freedom from want. In my talk today, I've attempted to reframe the history of interwar Europe in terms of a history of anti-globalism, and I have inevitably raised some questions about our own moment. I should say that this project was inspired by contemporary events. I began my research in 2016 in the context of the refugee crisis in Europe, the election of Donald Trump, the vote for Brexit, and the rise of right-wing populist regimes everywhere. Still, I would not have predicted when I began this research that it would be interrupted by a pandemic that disrupted global travel and trade on an unprecedented scale, nor would I have predicted a war in Ukraine that would disrupt global supply chains and bring a new focus on energy independence. During the pandemic in the United States, people reportedly fled cities, seeking homes with gardens where they could socially distance. Local foods and homespun goods have never been more popular, as anti-globalism has acquired a new focus on environmental sustainability. As in the interwar era, anti-globalism and deglobalism is resurgent on the left and right in democracies and in authoritarian states. As in the interwar era, debates about globalization often center on contested ideals of freedom, free trade and mobility for people and capital versus freedom from inequality or dependence. We don't yet know how the current wave of deglobalization will affect many aspects of our daily lives over the long run, from migration and travel to education, healthcare, the economy, the environment, global trade, the role of men and women in the home and workplace. But it certainly is a good moment to examine the last major era of anti-globalism and to remember the extent to which globalization is never unstoppable or inevitable. The lesson from my perspective is that when people don't have a genuine voice in shaping globalization, they will use mass politics as a tool to contest it. But for me, at least, this is not primarily or only a story about what the past can teach us about the present. Rather, I have been even more struck by the ways in which the present has reshaped my understanding of the past, everything from the effects of the First World War and the Great Depression to the rise of fascism. Between the two world wars, the continent was rebuilt in many ways to insulate and protect people from globalization's perceived and real negative consequences. Those efforts were shattered by a Second World War, after which nobody wanted to return to 1918 or 1929. After 1945, international leaders and activists would renew their efforts to create more equitable and sustainable forms of international and globalization. They strived to create forms of globalization that were compatible not only with the free mobility of goods, capital, and people, but freedom from poverty, dependence, and inequality. Whether or not they succeeded remains to be seen. Thanks.